Well, thank you all so much for having me. Especially thank you to the AGEP North Carolina Alliance. I appreciate you inviting me to spend a little bit of time with you all this morning. The title of my presentation is Strategies for Planning, Implementing, and Evaluating Department Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives. So what we'll do is we'll do a couple of quick introductions. I'm going to have you all type in the chat just so I can know a little bit more about who's in the room. I appreciate the raising of hands, but just in case others kind of missed that or weren't able to see the full screen, I'll then briefly introduce myself. I'd like to share a little bit about my department and our journey, kind of really thinking more seriously about DEI initiatives, this really just starting last semester. And then talk through 10 strategies. And this is kind of based on my experience in evaluation and literature, and also kind of reflections and experiences in my own department. Let's see here. So in the chat, if everyone would just take a quick second to write your name, your position and title, and just your affiliation. Okay, we're probably past the point where parents are apologizing for their children in the background, but just in case we're not, my 2-year-old toddler is home with me. His daycare shut down just this week because there are a few COVID cases after the holiday. So, you know, he's watching TV, but you know, you never know, he may pop in at any moment. So if everyone should just kind of be typing in the chat your name, your position or title. Yep, I see them coming in. Thank you so much for doing that. I think it's just useful for us to all kind of see who's in the room. So thank you so much. So those are coming through. So a little bit about me so that you know who's talking to you and the perspective that I bring. I am Afro-Latina. I'm a Black American and Panamanian. I'm a cisgender woman. I'm a wife, a mother, and an assistant professor of educational research methodology at UNC Greensboro. As mentioned, I co-direct our Office of Assessment, Evaluation, and Research Services, and I am co-PI of the STEM Program Evaluation Lab, where I, with one of my colleagues, evaluate 12 different Department of Defense and National Science Foundation funded projects. In terms of my research and background, I am interested in social justice oriented approaches to program evaluation, teaching and learning in evaluation, and the application of kind of social justice oriented evaluation or culturally responsive evaluation approaches in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education context. So to start off, let me tell you a little bit about my department, which I think makes for a unique and interesting case study. We're an educational research methodology department. We have a small faculty of there's just 10 of us, but we are pretty diverse and our students are incredibly diverse. We have one of the most diverse student bodies at the UNC Greensboro School of Education. And prior to this past semester, we've had no explicit commitment to diversity, and so as many of you know, on May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was murdered in Minnesota, and it was really an event that completely rocked the nation. It especially stood out for me because my birthday is actually May 25th, and so it's a day that I will forever remember. I'll remember how I felt after seeing the video. No, Bub, no. I'll remember how I felt watching the video being shared over and over again of his murder on social media. And at that time, I was really in the middle of preparing my promotion and tenure papers. And so I was feeling incredibly stressed, along with everything going with the pandemic and having a toddler home with me, and my husband is he's an essential worker at the hospital, and so he was still going to work. Okay, just give me a couple of minutes, okay? And so at that time, the beginning of June, I decided to write an email to all of my students of African descent. Look, I decided to write an email to my students of African descent to really see how they were doing. Because if they were feeling any way how I was feeling, they were feeling, despair, concern, disgust. And after sending the email to them, I convened a meeting with them and the two other faculty of African descent in my department. And after talking with them, one of the things that came out from that conversation was how many microaggressions, macroaggressions, and really disparities that they believe that they had experienced, not only on the UNCG campus, but within the department. And for me, I was completely stunned. I could not believe that some of the things I was hearing, I thought and continue to think of my department as a space where students from all different backgrounds can kind of come and flourish. And, some of the concerns I thought they had were really valid. And so at the time, I had encouraged them to write a letter to our department chair, and they were a bit nervous to do this. It was something that they kind of felt that it would be nice if they had faculty support. And at the time, I was, getting ready to put my tenure materials up, and I thought, oh my gosh, I don't really know if I want to have my name at the top of the letter with all of these kind of demands to my department chair about changes that I wanted to make. And so after kind of having some deep reflection and some conversations with a few mentors, I decided to kind of lead the writing of the letter to our chair. And as they say, the rest is history. I really think that after he received that letter, it was from all of the students of African descent and the faculty of African descent. And it was a bit of I don't want to say a list of demands, but a list of concerns and a list of requests of things that would change. And some of those would be that there would be mandatory trainings for faculty, mandatory trainings for students. There would be statements, there would be opportunities for discussion of these issues in the department. And again, this is a department that has typically shied away from anything, even talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. And the faculty themselves have admittedly said that, well, I teach, methodology, so there's really no space in my classes to be thinking about this. But after the letter was sent, conversations began, and surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, our chair was really open to this, and the faculty were really open to this, and they kind of just needed a nudge to move forward. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about kind of what we are doing now, but I would say in some ways it's been a complete 180. I would say in some ways our department has kind of been the leader in thinking about efforts in DEI within our school now. So we used to have department meetings once a month. Now we have department meetings twice a month that all faculty attends. And one of those meetings is explicitly committed to DEI. We've brought in external groups for training. We have training our student leadership organization. They've brought in people for trainings and conversations. And so really, it's become a core part of who we are and an explicit part of our values. And we've just started a strategic plan to think about what are our goals and what are our long-term goals to make sure that we continue to engage with these topics. And so I think for anyone who kind of says, well, my department can't really think about these sorts of issues, and it's hard for us to think about this, then I would say that, it is possible. And so I wanted to share with you some strategies to kind of think about this and infuse these topics into the curriculum and goals of different departments. So I kind of looking through the literature and looking through my experiences, I have 10 strategies here, and I'll talk through each one of them and I'll talk through each one, and I will talk through some kind of literature associated with each one. So the 10 strategies are, the first is that internal buy-in is necessary but not sufficient. The second is putting it in the agenda. Don't stop at diversity. Adopt an anti-deficit orientation. Prioritize internal and external facing initiatives. Learning from the literature. Institutionalization of sponsored projects. Invest in external facilitation and training. Showing the data or evaluation, and don't let great get in the way of good. And so we'll kind of look at these each individually. So the first is that internal buy-in is necessary, but not sufficient. And so, there is a plethora of research that shows that academic institutional change can be incredible. And so oftentimes these initiatives will start with someone who is a cheerleader, someone who is really committed to these issues and will push this forward. And cheerleaders are a great start to kind of bring up these issues, but buy-in from the entire department is even better. And while buy-in is good, really a shared commitment is best. And I think taking a bottom-up and a top-down approach is what really works well. There's been a great deal of research that has looked at different leaders' roles in ensuring that this work continues. So, grassroots work is important. It's important to have students on board, staff on board, faculty on board, but really also what's needed is a leader who is going to be committed to pushing this work forward and keeping this work at the forefront of conversations and making sure that there are resources dedicated to doing this work. And so one way to ensure that this work really continues on is that, that it gets put on the agenda on a regular basis. And as I mentioned in my department, we spend an hour and a half every single month talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And so if it is on the agenda, if it remains on the agenda, it's going to get talked about, it's going to be included. And really, I think long-term is thinking about a strategic plan, thinking about one of my concerns was that, after George Floyd's murder, everyone was really interested in talking about this. Everyone was reading Ibram Kendi, everyone was having these conversations, but, we were still in a pandemic. We're still in the middle of a budget crisis. And I had a lot of concerns that once the semester started that these important topics were going to get pushed to the side because there's lots of important topics in our institutions. And so to make sure that we continued talking, we continued engaging with some issues related to this, we made sure it stayed on the agenda. And as long as because we've committed to having a meeting about this every month, we are sure that, while we do have to talk about student budgets and promotion and tenure and talk about these other topics, we make sure that we have time. There's always going to be time to engage with diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of the things that is also important is this adoption of an anti-deficit orientation. I like to tell this story of a climate survey from a client where we did a climate survey of the department, and we found that graduate students of color were having a less positive experience than their white peers. It wasn't that they were having a negative experience, they were having a less positive experience. And one of the things that the faculty and PI said, okay, one of the things that the PI said was, well, I think what's happening here is that students of color, they come in with a different idea of what graduate school is. They come in with a different idea of what graduate school should be. And it's not really the department's fault that they're having this experience. Is that we got to change. We have to teach them about what, we have to help them rethink about what graduate school should be, and so they won't be disappointed anymore. And I mean, that was certainly one interpretation of the data. But one of the things as they're externally evaluated that I talked to them about was that, they really need to take a lens where instead of saying what's wrong with, underrepresented minorities or those who are disadvantaged in this situation, we should really be thinking about what's going on with the climate here and what's going on within our department that is making certain students feel different way. And I think when it's time to really implement and initiate department initiatives, the place to start is at an anti-deficit orientation. And so this is reflecting on how we can make the context better for everyone, more than why are some people having a different experience and what's different about them, right? And also kind of considering the strengths that different individuals bring, and the different, how can we enhance that? How can we utilize that? How can we learn from that? And so, again, there's lots of research associated with strengths-based orientation, anti-deficit orientations, and how to make sure that those are really going to be infused into the work that we do. So the next strategy really has to do with diversity and making sure that we are not stopping at diversity. I find that whenever there are conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, usually diversity is a starting point. And it's not a bad place to start. Saying that that representation is important, saying that we need to have groups from various populations seen and represented at all levels in our institutions is incredibly important. And it's a great place to start, but it's not enough. It's not an ending point. And, you know, oftentimes it can be incredibly problematic to try to increase diversity and be successful in increasing diversity, but then not taking a look at inclusivity, or then not taking a look at equity. And so while diversity is a place to start, we also have to think about what's the climate here. Are we making sure that our students and our various faculty from different backgrounds have equal opportunities, or that those who disproportionately don't usually have opportunities, making sure that they have access to more opportunities than those who are often the ones who are tapped. I also just want to say briefly that, you know, diversity is a great place to start when it comes to department initiatives, but we in academia don't live in a vacuum. Everything that's happening in the world impacts our students, impacts our faculty. I am thinking more and more about the fact that my first class that I'm going to teach next week is going to be the day after the inauguration. And I don't know what's going to happen on the 20th, but I do know it's something, lots of things, probably good and maybe some bad are going to happen. And so I've been trying to think about, well, how is that going to impact my students when they show up to class? How am I going to be feeling when I show up to class? And I think it's important that when we think about diversity, when we think about the climate, oftentimes if departments, especially departments chairs, sit quietly and don't acknowledge the concerns and the pains and the frustrations that many are feeling, then I think we're doing a disservice to ourselves, we're doing a disservice to our students. And I know that there are lots of really great things and lots of really horrible things that happen around the world every single day. And so we cannot address every single thing that happens, but certainly when there are things that happen here in North Carolina, and when there are things that make it to the national stage, something should be said. You know, for those of you who attended my strategies for supporting graduate students of color, I can remember the deafening silence for the first few days after Kevin Lamont Scott's murder down in Charlotte, and having students in my office talking to me about it, and just realizing that, you know, there wasn't right away. Eventually our chancellor did say something, but I don't think anything ever came out from our dean and not my department chair about the Black Lives Matter movement, or how students may or may not be feeling, or and not just students, but faculty may be feeling. And so it's important for us to bring diverse populations into the fold and make sure that they have opportunities. But we also have to consider, do they feel included? Do they feel welcome? And ensuring that some of the different events that are happening, even including international students, making sure that there's a place for them to speak about it and to really reflect on what's happening. So related to that is this prioritization of what is going to be internal facing and what is going to be external facing. And we have talked a ton about this in our department, because while transparency is important, we have started to think about, well, there's probably different goals and purposes associated with what we're trying to accomplish, right? And so I do think it's important that there are statements and affirmations that are put out on websites and social media, so that those who are not within our unit or our department know where we stand, know whom we support, know a little bit about our values. There's also, it's really important that we have internal documents that are kind of just shared with just faculty, and some internal documents that are just shared with students, to ensure that they know what's happening. One of the things, so we had our first department meeting last week, and the time it fell, it happens to be our diversity, equity, and inclusion meeting. And one of the things that was brought up during that meeting was that, you know, we know that we're doing all this work. We know that we're meeting every month and that all of these things are in our minds. But the reality is that almost no one else knows what we're doing. And that's problematic, because others need to know that there's solidarity and that there is a place for these conversations. There is a place for these commitments in academia. And our students need to know, right? Like we're still committed to this. This is still at the forefront of our minds. And so one of the suggestions that I made was that once a semester, our department chair kind of send out an email just to faculty and students saying, here's where we are and here's where we think we're going. And also acknowledges, you know, the state of the world, the state of things that are going on. I think it's important to acknowledge that right now, some people may be feeling a bit anxious. Right now, there are a variety of emotions as we begin this semester, continuing on the pandemic that is disproportionately affecting certain populations, continuing on worrying about tuition waivers and assistantships for students for the summer and for next year, continuing on with issues of racial violence and insurrection at our Capitol. And so just acting like it's not happening, or acting like, well, those things, we're not going to talk about that in class, can really hinder, would say, the culture and climate that we're attempting to build. And so again, there's different purposes. And of course, you shouldn't put, you know, all of your meeting notes and everything like that on your website. But I also think it's important to be really clear about your commitments externally and start thinking internally, especially starting to make a long-term plan. I often find that when in my program evaluation endeavors, and you know, even in talking to various faculty across the university, is that everything that we're talking about, you know, understanding organizational change, understanding the best practices for implementation of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, taking an anti-deficit orientation, taking a critical approach to pedagogy. You know, this is in the literature. This has been studied. There is plenty of research to support inclusive excellence. There's plenty of research to support the importance of diversity and inclusion. And, you know, certainly I think it behooves us to make sure that we try to familiarize ourselves with some of this so that we don't run into pitfalls, and that we can really learn from others and learn from research and kind of try to implement evidence-based practices. Okay, there you go. And so really, I think some of the most important literature, which I've begun to familiarize myself with, has to do with organizational and institutional change. And also importantly, I think we can learn a lot from minority serving institutions and from the efforts that they have put forth to serve the populations that they have, and other kind of majority serving institutions can learn and implement some of these practices. And you know, others have kind of committed their lives, committed their whole tenure to this, to research on these topics, and it makes sense for us to take a little bit of time to do some research and to better understand. You know, even related to AGEP and to tons of other National Science Foundation projects, is there's a need for us to really institutionalize best practices from these sponsored projects. We know that after these projects go, after the money ends, you know, there is some sort of expectation often from the funder that a piece of the project is going to live on. I don't think that this is something that is explored enough in terms of how we can better understand and improve our efforts to address diversity, equity, and inclusion at the department level. And there are plenty of evidence-based activities that can be institutionalized. And that is, you know, the two citations that I have here is one is from the Advanced Technological Education Program, and as well as the Advanced Program, which has to do with recruitment, retention, and advancement of faculty. And so there's millions and millions of dollars that are poured in to research and training and all sorts of other sponsored research projects, and we learn so much from that. And these oftentimes, I find that, you know, my evaluation reports have a great deal of information in them that is not only useful to the project, but that can be useful to, well, here's what we know about how the various things work within this context. And sometimes, you know, that work is useful while the project is going on, but then, you know, no one else ever sees those reports. And so oftentimes that literature, which I refer to as kind of gray literature, doesn't make it into, you know, doesn't always make it into peer-reviewed journals, right? And so then there's all of this wealth of information of things that we've learned, and then it doesn't show up anywhere else, and it doesn't live on. And so I think we have to take a more proactive stance on really institutionalizing the best parts of our sponsored research. And we know that the majority of these projects, especially for the National Science Foundation, they have EDI or DEI initiatives and goals. And so they can really help us think well about this within our department. So I think there's a point where we can only take ourselves so far. We can only know so much. And the reality is that, again, there are others who know a lot about this and who do this really well. And so it's important that after we've kind of had our conversations about our commitments, after we've had our conversations about our goals and where we're going to go, the next step is really to seek out experts who can help us think about these topics. And I should mention pay them, right? And pay people for their time, pay people for you know, their expertise. And so one of the things that we have done, and I would recommend other departments consider reaching out to these folks because they did an excellent job. And actually, so it's called Fair Play. And they're a group that had a National Science Foundation, or probably, I think it's NIH grant. And they developed a video game that helps teach faculty in STEM about implicit bias. And so you play a Black male graduate student, and as you play the game, you experience all these sorts of implicit biases, and they explain to you. But along with playing the game, there's a 2-day workshop associated with it that the team at University of Wisconsin-Madison facilitates, and it's really excellent. We had them come to our department at UNC Greensboro, even though we're not STEM. I still think they did a great job. And they also came to, we have like a science pedagogy and teaching in science and STEM network on campus. And so they came and did a workshop with them. And, I think ultimately the thing is that sometimes it takes someone externally to help facilitate these difficult conversations. One of the things that happened during our department facilitation was that there was a lot of time spent by students of color and faculty of color kind of explaining that, what's kind of presented in the game is an actual representation of things that they've experienced, right? People asking about their hair, people suspecting them of doing things that they shouldn't be doing, people asking them how they got in, people bringing up affirmative action as if that's the only reason why they can be there. And it was such an interesting experience to have someone else facilitate this conversation, because we had students and faculty, after they played the game, come back and say, wow, it seemed like some of those things were really extreme. It seemed like I kept thinking like, wow, it's like, do things like this actually happen? Like, I've never experienced anything like this. And we had faculty who came back and said, wow, like I actually have probably committed some of these acts. And so having, and then we also had graduate students and faculty come back and say, oh, this is nothing. Like I've experienced, way worse than this, right? And so we had having someone experience and help us navigate those emotions and those opinions after playing the game, and also talking through it. The game is actually all based in research. It's based all in, they didn't make up any experiences. They took them from literature about experiences that graduate students of color go through. And so I thought for us, that was one of the first trainings that we've done. This coming semester, we're going to do a town hall where we're having an external person come and facilitate a conversation that's not just kind of based in the game and based on implicit bias. But for us, it was a really great place to start, especially because we had some students and faculty who were really, really familiar with this, had talked about this, were familiar with the literature from the psychological background, and then others who were just kind of hearing about this for the first time. And I think it can be a little bit awkward having those conversations, and so sometimes having someone external to help with the facilitation can be incredibly useful. So just like any sort of effort that is done, it's really important that it's evaluated, right? It's important that you kind of see where you are from a baseline level. And I don't just mean quantitatively, but to kind of take a look at where you are from a baseline level, and then looking to see how things are going over time, formatively and summatively, right? And oftentimes these initiatives are evaluated from a lens or from an evaluator whose values don't necessarily explicitly match the values and approaches that are utilized by the project or by the department. And I think it's important that it's not enough to just have someone come and evaluate, but it's important that someone who is going to kind of attend to various nuances, that someone who's going to be responsive to the culture and context, and that is sensitive to the social justice efforts, it is employed. And there are intended and unintended outcomes associated with projects like this. And so kind of thinking about, well, what are some of the negative consequences that could potentially happen is really important, and categorizing that and staying on top of that. And kind of most importantly, I know when we were starting at my department, one of the things that people kept saying was, oh, I don't know if we're ready. We all need to read a little bit more. Maybe we need to think about this some more. Maybe we should do X, Y, and Z before we start. And someone had a really good comment about the fact that sometimes, we're searching for great, but that's getting in the way of what could potentially be good. And I'm not saying that you should just start without planning or start without kind of thinking through activities or thinking through the ways in which various initiatives will work together. But you don't want to be in a position where you never get started because you're trying to make sure that things are perfect. You're trying to make sure that you have all the answers. I think one of the most important aspects of this work is embracing vulnerability, which for anyone can be a bit unnerving, can be a bit scary. But that's the stance that I try to take and that we've taken within my department about, okay, well, we don't know everything. So this is why we're having external people, or here's why we're going to do some reading, or here's why we're all, whoever's interested is going to participate in this book club. But we didn't feel it was right to just not do anything. We didn't feel that it was right for us to just wait and have time continue to go by without kind of addressing, the elephant that's been in the room and that many have seen for a long time, and that others are kind of just seeing a bit more clearly recently. And so what I'd like to do now is I've kind of wanted to make sure that I left enough time for a bit of discussion. I know we'll have more discussion later on, but I'd love for if there are questions, or I can talk a bit more specifically about some of these strategies, but I wanted to make sure that we have about 20 minutes, make sure that I left enough time for us to have a bit of discussion.
Thank
So
you, Aisha.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the floor is open. I see there are quite a few comments about the game. A lot of interest in that. Some of the audience, they already have played this game and they have shared their experiences about the game. Can you?
I'm not familiar with the game, but I did have a question. And is it better to play this game in the context of the workshop? Is it worthwhile to play it just in isolation, separate from a workshop?
I think they've done a really good job. I think it's worth playing just by yourself. You play it as part of the workshop, but so you start off, and as you are playing the game, and it's actually pretty user friendly for those who are not like video gamers, and they explain how to do it. And there's nothing to download. You can just play right online. And as you're going through and playing the game, there are little pop-ups that kind of tell you, oh, you just experienced a microaggression. Oh, you just experienced imposter syndrome. And so I think it's definitely worth going and playing the game and not necessarily having to wait until someone comes and facilitates. One of the things that I really appreciate about them is that they actually do facilitation for free. I should have mentioned that, right? And I know that there's a lot of really important but expensive opportunities out there. But Christy, I can send out the information of the PI's name, but part of their mandate is to like do these facilitations. But I would say go ahead and play it on your own. It's a really evocative, and you can even play it as a department and then have your own conversations as well.
So just to follow up on that, this is the kind of thing, for example, that if we contacted them, they might come and facilitate this with our department.
Oh, no, exactly. Not they might, they definitely would. I mean, I think they collect data, they're a project. So they collect data at the end about what worked, what didn't work. And they used to do it where it was they would actually go out to places and they would do it for free because it was part of the grant. But now everything is obviously completely online. And so, like I said, all you have to do is reach out to them and say, hey, our department's interested. Would you do this? And they will find the time, because they have a team of like 10 different facilitators who will help with the facilitation. They have graduate students. And interestingly, right now, they just got their second grant, like the phase 2, and they are working on a training for graduate students. And that probably won't be ready for the next few years, but they are still hosting these trainings online for faculty. And I will mention that for our presentation, they came, but they did, all of our faculty and all of our graduate students came. and it's Christine Pribanow. But I can, if anyone emails me, I can put you in contact with the PI.
Thank you.
So there are several questions from the audience. Let's see. Some key part of the presentation, I mean, okay, anti-deficit mentoring.
Yes, those were just my things that hit home with me about kind of what we're trying to do in transformative steps with our graduate program at North Carolina A&T. And we're actually a growing program, and I really liked the idea of some of these academic unit meetings happening multiple times per month so that we address supportive issues in a way that's very well considered. And I made note of the literature articles I need to be reading this weekend as well, because there's just sometimes seems there's not enough time to have a strong foundation on these things in terms of anti-deficit mentoring, for example. I mean, who among us didn't succeed because somebody took the time to tell us we had value and worth when others weren't really on board with that? So just my initial take on it for what it's worth as a graduate coordinator.
So Aisha, there is a comment, how the initiatives live beyond funding period. You already discussed a little bit, but you want to little bit elaborate on that because that's
Sure.
always the issue, because once grant is over, people forget about it. And
Sure. So, I mean, obviously, like the grant itself cannot live on, but I think components, especially things that you learn in relationship to mentoring about the grant, can definitely live on. And so, for example, I evaluated an NRT where they tried this like this like co-advising because it was really interdisciplinary, and they found that it worked really, really, really well. And so they, after the grant was over, they implemented that students in their department who were on a certain track would have 2 advisors. And so that was a component that directly came out of something that they had learned from their sponsored research project. And so that's the type of thing that, I mean, of course, like there can be curricular changes, of course there can be new courses or you know, follow-up sort of funding models from other funding sources after kind of these grants are over. But there are certainly things that we can learn that about kind of what works and what doesn't work that can be adapted and elevated to the department level.
thank you. While discussion is going on, I have put a link for the survey. I'm putting one more time. Whenever you guys get time, please click on the link. It is go.ncsu.edu/Boyce. So please fill out the survey by clicking on the link as side by side the discussion is. Please go ahead and put your questions.
I have one small question.
Yes, go ahead.
I didn't put in the chat, but in the did you say that in your department you have diversity meeting like once or twice a month?
Yeah, so we have department meetings once a month. We used to have department meetings once a month where you just talk about all the department things. Maybe something diversity would come up, maybe mostly it wouldn't. And after the letter was sent out, we as a faculty decided that from now on, henceforth, we are now going to have 2 department meetings a month. And one of those department meetings is committed to talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So every month on the first Tuesday, we meet and we talk for an hour and a half about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So issues, planning. Right now we're working on a strategic plan and goals. But like last semester, we were just scrambling like, oh, we should do training. Oh, how are our students doing? That sort of thing. And I think that has been a total game changer for us because it's always going to be on the agenda. There's always time to talk about it. We know that it's always going to come up and there's always going to be space for us to kind of continue to work on this. And right now we're focused on racial equity, but our goal is to kind of, once we feel like we've kind of begun addressing this even more, our goal is to move on to different types of equity and to thinking about other sort of disadvantaged populations and trainings and everything
We
like
are
that.
thinking similar, thinking many things in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics here at UNCC. And we have a new chair, Dr. Khan here, he's here, and he may chime in probably how to train our people, at least our faculty, about these topics. How often should we have meeting on diversity? And we have been thinking this kind of thing. That is why I was asking this question.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Just having the time. I mean, if it's what gets measured and what's on the agenda gets done. And at first in August of last year, we were like, oh, this is so important, let's do this. But then we spent our whole department meeting talking about budget and COVID and in-person versus hybrid classes. And then we realized, oh, now we have 5 minutes to talk about these issues. And we were just like, yeah, this is not going to be
yes, exactly. So if you put like 5 minutes or 10 minutes for this topic, this is not enough.
Yeah, exactly. It's not enough time.
Thanks, Jay. May I chime in? I'm actually the chair that Jay mentioned.
Dr. Khan, he just moved in from Clemson, actually.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for this conference and the presentation, just wonderful. Really enjoyed your presentation, and Jay for stepping up from our department to be part of this discussion. One thing that is very interesting, what you mentioned, is I was at the chairs meeting yesterday for the American Math Society. And we also had a significant discussion about that. We are part of the STEM, and Yvette from the UNC and our team knows, what other kind of initiatives we're working on. It was very interesting. They said, Aisha, is that they actually did several different options. Like they had a book that they were reading together in the department. Like, they would read a specific book, and there were some really good ones in the list, and they would have a discussion group like that. They also had some people feel more, comfortable with watching something. So they would watch something and then talk about it. And then there would be another group, they would just like, hey, I prefer to discuss, so they would just discuss. So they had these different threads. Smith College and a few other departments around the country talked about that yesterday. This is a very big topic within the American Math Society chairs meeting yesterday. This is a joint meeting for all the chairs that would like to meet every year in the American Math Society. And as you know, if you look at the numbers for the data in STEM, and if you look at the mathematics and statistics and so on, then I think that's even gets more difficult, more challenging, in terms of that. But I would like to ask everybody, and including yourself, that what you mentioned, what worked for you, and I think that every department is different. So I think that having a conversation is the key, and then having the time to have the conversation is the key. And I think that to get started with something like a book, I thought that was very interesting, and I would like to hear from you and others if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's important to take a multi-pronged approach, right? So I've heard from other colleagues, they're like, oh yeah, we read a book over the summer. And I'm like, oh, well, what else do you do? And they're like, oh no, we read the book. And just like we know about trainings, one training is not gonna change enough. It has to be this continual engagement, this continual commitment, right? I'm on the committee for faculty access and equity within the School of Education. So we have a good idea of like, we're starting to track like what various departments are doing. And so, doing a climate study, yes, that's a great thing to do. Doing a study where you're, looking at various experiences, that's a great thing to do. But, and I know we're all busy, we have lots of priorities, but if we're really going to commit to this, it can't be something that's a one-off. It can't be like, oh, we did something this semester, so we're not going to do something next semester. So I can just say what we've committed to, and then would love to hear from others. So we've committed to that there will be one department-wide, strongly encouraged training a semester for everybody, right? And let me say, like, the fact that we have all of our faculty come to me is astounding. Like, I actually can't believe it, but they're all committed and they all come. So we had the Fair Play last semester, and we're planning one for this semester. There are also our student organization is hosting seminars and trainings that are kind of student geared. Faculty, we said that we want faculty to attend like one training or symposium or something like that a semester outside of the department level training. And then we also have a book club that's going that those who want to be a part of are a part of. And now, like I said, we're considering an annual survey to better understand our student outcomes, which is important anyways, but then we're going to take a look at any sort of equity issues there and see if there's any differences in experiences or outcomes according to demographics. And then one of the things that we did was we engaged the UNCG, the Chancellor's Fellow for Campus Climate, or the Chancellor Fellow for EDI, and she came and she helped us think through what should our goals be? What are some realistic goals, right? We also had the members from the advanced team come and talk to us to say like, okay, what's realistic for us to get done? And so I think those are the types of things that are really important.
So there is another question about, can you talk about your position as an assistant professor and its impact on your decisions about what to say and how to say within your department?
Yeah, so I think as I mentioned at the beginning, kind of when all this happened, I was like getting ready to hit submit on all of my packet for promotion and tenure. And I've been pretty vocal about, I've been pretty vocal about my concerns about, the fact that, when these sorts of issues come up, that it's certain faculty who often get tapped to do the work and they have this invisible service, but it doesn't show up anywhere on your annual report or annual review, where that, especially faculty of color have this invisible service, or LGBTQIA faculty. And so as an assistant professor, I was on, I want to say in fairness that I have had a very strong tenure case. I have lots of funding and lots of articles. And so I wasn't like worried, but I also was worried because it's not done until it's done. I finally kind of just made the decision, do I want to be in a department where I can step up and say things and make a change? And I really thought, like, if I had tenure, how would I handle this? And then I just acted as if I had tenure, I would just write this letter. I would talk to the students. I would advocate for these sorts of things. Okay, go get it for me, okay? So, I think as an assistant professor, sometimes I think realistically, you do have less power, especially if you haven't gone through reappointment, or especially if you're someone who you might feel like you're on the line, right? Like you're not a superstar. And so I do honestly feel like it's a very real thing to feel concerned to bring up certain issues. But I feel like that's when it's important to have really good mentorship within and external to the department, and to make sure that you have advocates for you and for these issues besides yourself. And I think one of the things that made the letter so strong was that we had 15 student signatures. So it wasn't like just me like, hey, I think these things are important. I think you all should listen to them. It was that we had every single student who identified as Black also signed the letter, and a couple of other faculty members as well. So I will say that, 4 years ago, I felt like I could speak up less. My department chair always tells me that that's not a real thing. And I would always say, as a white male, I don't believe that you understand. It is a real thing. It is a real concern to be seen as an angry Black woman, or as someone who's a troublemaker, or someone who's a rocking the ship sort of person. And I had those conversations and said, I am concerned that other people should be bringing this up. And I'm really pleased now, because finally something has changed where I'm not the first person to say, oh, that's an equity issue. Like someone else beats me to the punch, which to me is one of the true measures of success.